Hey guys, so today we'll talk about GDP, or as I'm sure you know, gross domestic product, which is a very important measure in determining the economic value of a country. So as you can see, the GDP is calculated using four components: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So let's take a look at what each one means. So the first one, consumption. It's pretty much what you spend, the everyday things you buy, from your phones, from your clothing, groceries. And you can see on the graph here, consumption is usually above 50% of the share of GDP in developed countries. Here in the United States, it's above 60, and you can see that it's been growing recently in the past decades, with the gray bars being recessions. Now, as a side note, we always hear the word recession, but what does it really mean? Let's take a look at an example. So we have four quarters, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. And in each one, we have billions of dollars in economic output. So this is a mid-level country, 500 billion in the first quarter, 520 in the second quarter, so we have 4% growth. Then 510 billion in the third quarter, which is a minus 1.92 growth from the second quarter, right? Because it dropped. And then another minus 1.96 to 500 in the fourth quarter. Now, by the definition of recession, when you have two quarters with GDP growth below zero, it's a recession. That's what it is. So even though we end up with 500 and 500 in the first and fourth quarters, it's the same. Nothing really changed throughout the year. We still call it a recession because there were two quarters where the economy got worse. So that's pretty much it. Now, let's look at the second component, investment. Investments is any business that invests in it to improve their business. So it can mean buying machinery, buying land, pretty much any development. Now, if we look at the graphs, we can see that investments really drop during recessions. Why is this? It's because businesses don't really know what's going to happen. They have uncertainty. So they don't really want to invest any money during recessions because they're not sure whether or not they're going to make their money back. That's why we have these huge drops, especially during the 2008 financial crisis. Now, the third component, government spending. It's also pretty obvious. It means any money that the government spends on schools, roads, military, anything like that. Now, really the interesting thing about this graph is that we could see that the governments of United Kingdom and United States really had huge spikes in the 1910s and the 1940s. What do you think that correlates with? Well, if you think the world wars, then you're right, because really the economies of both countries were concentrated on the war effort. So all the government spending was going to the war effort. That's why it spiked so much. So that makes sense. And now, finally, the last component, net exports. It stands for exports minus imports. Now, here in the United States, we have a trade deficit, meaning we buy more than we sell. We import more than we export. Now, the same thing is true with this graph. If you look at it, especially during the 2008 financial crisis, it spikes upwards. Notice it spikes upwards closer to zero because it's a negative number. It's a negative share of GDP. And during the financial crisis, we began importing less, meaning the net exports grew closer to zero. That's why the share also got closer to zero. So those are the four main components of calculating a GDP. Now let's take a look at an example. Say you go out and buy a cute little muffin for $2. Makes sense, $2 are added to the economy. But what about the previous steps that were taken to get that muffin? So let's take a look at this. First, we have fertilizer, right? A company makes fertilizer. Then the company sells it to a farmer. The farmer makes wheat. Then that farmer sells it to a miller who makes flour. And that guy sells it to a baker, who in turn makes the $2 muffin which you just bought, right? But at every step of the process, there's some money being spent. So do we count it or not? Let's look at the basic example. Say you bought it for $2, like we said before. Now let's just pretend now, even though these won't be real figures if we calculate to scale, that the fertilizer to make the wheat costs 20 cents, right? Then the wheat is sold to the miller for 50 cents. The miller sells the flour to the baker for $1, and then you buy the muffin for $2. We don't add all the sums. We don't add 20 cents plus 50 cents plus $1 plus $2. This is called the value added method. Economists only look at the final $2 which you spent because these are intermediary goods. We don't calculate them when we look at the GDP. It's also worth mentioning that the GDP isn't really the best way to measure an economy because, first of all, it doesn't take into account wealth inequality. That's something that's called the Gini coefficient. Another thing that we should take into account is the online economy, the internet economy, which is something that didn't really exist 20 years ago. And I think a good example of that is Netflix. So now a basic subscription I think is what, like $9? And for $9 you can watch unlimited movies. So that $9 is added to the GDP. Great. But like 20 or 30 years ago, for every movie that you wanted to watch, you had to go out and buy a VHS tape for $9 or $10. So now we only add one $9 for unlimited movies, but before we would have had to add $9 or $10 every time. So what's really the right way to calculate this? We don't know yet. Who knows? Maybe you'll be the great economist who will make this theory come true. So that was it for our GDP video, guys. I hope you liked it. I hope it's making your college life a lot simpler. You can also click subscribe, check out some more videos, and we hope to see you in the future. Stay geekly, my friends.